For example, Homeland Security agents who previously worked on human trafficking have been redeployed to supporting the president's cruel and reckless immigration agenda. That means experts on transnational crime are no longer spending their time cracking down on human trafficking rings. They are instead patrolling the streets with ICE to check the papers and harass nonviolent immigrants. The backwardsness doesn't end there. The administration also abandoned the United States' role as a global leader in the fight against trafficking. In July, President Trump gutted the State's Department office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, which has spent the past 25 years working to combat human sex.
Listen to what you just heard, because Congresswoman Shontel Brown is speaking truths that should shake every single one of us to our moral core. And before we even get into the weeds of policy and precedent and the absolute catastrophe unfolding in real time across this country, we need to understand that this is not normal. None of this is normal, and the normalization of horror is itself one of the most insidious weapons in the authoritarian playbook, because when you hear that experts who spent their entire professional lives tracking down human trafficking rings, people who know how to dismantle networks that enslave women and children, have been pulled off those cases and sent to patrol neighborhoods with ICE checking papers and harassing nonviolent immigrants, you should feel rage coursing through your veins like electricity. Immigrant and civil rights groups allege federal authorities have launched an indiscriminate enforcement blitz that's mostly netted day laborers and workers from Latino communities who are not threats to public safety, and we're about to unpack exactly what that means for the fabric of democracy itself. But first, let me tell you what's coming in this commentary, because you need to brace yourself for the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the cynicism, the deliberate cruelty masquerading as law and order. We're going to expose how ICE agents conducting raids frequently travel in unmarked vehicles, wear plainclothes and facial coverings, and refuse to identify themselves or present warrants, creating what amounts to a secret police force operating on American soil. We're going to reveal the staggering data showing that 65% of the people booked into ICE detention since October 2024 have no criminal convictions, and more than 93% of those booked were never convicted of violent offenses, despite the administration's constant refrain about targeting dangerous criminals. And we're going to connect the dots between Brown's devastating revelation about gutted anti-trafficking efforts and the broader pattern of deliberate institutional sabotage that defines this administration's approach to immigration. Because what she's describing isn't just poor policy prioritization, it's a calculated dismantling of the mechanisms that protect the most vulnerable human beings on this planet, while simultaneously terrorizing immigrant communities under the false banner of public safety. The historical parallels here are not subtle, and we cannot afford to look away from them because Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries compared mask-wearing by ICE agents to secret police forces in authoritarian regime. And when a sitting member of Congress invokes the Gestapo, they are not being hyperbolic. They are reading the room of history and recognizing the architecture of oppression being constructed brick by brick in real time. U.S. Rep. Stephen Lynch likened the actions of masked and ununiformed immigration officers to the Gestapo. And you know what? When federal agents who won't identify themselves grab people off the streets, that's not law enforcement, that's state terror. And the fact that this is happening in the United States of America in 2025 should horrify every person who has ever claimed to care about liberty or justice or the foundational principles that supposedly distinguish democracies from authoritarian nightmares. Let's talk about what Congresswoman Brown actually said, because the details matter, and they reveal a system-wide corruption of priorities that goes far beyond simple bureaucratic inefficiency. She's telling us that Homeland Security agents who previously worked on human trafficking have been redeployed to supporting the president's cruel and reckless immigration agenda, which means that experts on transnational crime are no longer spending their time cracking down on human trafficking rings, but are instead patrolling streets with ICE to check papers and harass nonviolent immigrants. And do you understand what that means in practice? Because I need you to really sit with this for a moment. Human trafficking represents some of the most heinous violations of human dignity imaginable. We're talking about modern slavery, about children being sold into sexual exploitation, about labor trafficking operations that literally own human beings and force them to work under threat of violence, and the people who know how to investigate these networks, who understand the international dimensions, who can trace the money and the connections, and actually dismantle these operations, have been reassigned to immigration theater. The Trump administration drastically cut the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons staff, and this wasn't some budgetary constraint or efficiency measure. This was ideological vandalism. These layoffs reduced the staff at the office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons by 71%. And when you gut an office by that magnitude, you're not streamlining operations, you're destroying institutional capacity, you're ensuring that the work cannot be done. And here's what makes this so unconscionably perverse. The Trump administration and its MAGA coalition have spent years screaming about human trafficking. They've made it a centerpiece of their conspiratorial worldview. They've weaponized concern about child trafficking to justify all manner of authoritarian excess. And then when they're actually in power with the ability to combat trafficking, they systematically dismantle the apparatus designed to do exactly that. The State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons was gutted, decimating a team that worked to combat labor and sex trafficking abroad, and helped coordinate domestic efforts across other agencies. And you want to know why? Because it's not complicated. Because actually fighting human trafficking requires international cooperation, requires believing in expertise, requires investing in long-term investigative work that doesn't produce immediate visible results for photo ops and campaign rallies. The cruelty isn't a bug, it's a feature, and the specific configuration of that cruelty reveals everything about the actual priorities at work here. Because if you genuinely cared about protecting vulnerable people from trafficking, you would resource anti-trafficking offices, you would empower the experts, you would build international coalitions. But if your actual goal is xenophobic theater, if what you really want is to terrorize immigrant communities and create a visible spectacle of enforcement that appeals to the darkest nativist impulses of your base, then you do exactly what this administration has done. Now we need to talk about those masked agents, because this is where the authoritarian aesthetics become impossible to ignore, and where the threat to civil liberties extends far beyond immigrant communities to encompass every single person in this country. ICE agents conducting raids frequently travel in unmarked vehicles, wear plainclothes and facial coverings, and refuse to identify themselves or present warrants, and the administration's justification for this is that agents need to protect themselves from being doxxed. But critics are quick to point out the irony of the Trump administration demanding bans on masks during protests on college campuses and other locations, while allowing immigration officers to wear them to detain immigrants. The hypocrisy is almost comical, except there's nothing funny about federal agents in masks grabbing people without identifying themselves, because that violates every principle of accountable democratic governance. It creates conditions where abuse flourishes in darkness, where there's no mechanism for redress when rights are violated, where the fundamental relationship between citizens and the state becomes predicated on fear rather than consent. A former ICE official said the more aggressive enforcement tactics, including the use of masks, creates this feeling that we're living in a lawless country, and that quote deserves to be emblazoned everywhere, because it captures the profound irony at the heart of this entire enterprise. An administration that claims to be restoring law and order is creating lawlessness through the very methods it's deploying to enforce the law. When agents won't identify themselves, when they operate in unmarked vehicles, when they refuse to show warrants, when they grab people outside courthouses where they're attending their own immigration hearings, they're not upholding the law, they're demonstrating contempt for legal process. They're showing that power trumps procedure, that force matters more than rights, and that's not a police state in embryonic form, that's already a functioning police state apparatus. Federal officers, often masked and not wearing uniforms or displaying badges, have been arresting people outside courtroom hearings, during traffic stops and in workplaces, and each of those locations tells you something crucial about the systematic nature of this campaign of terror. Because when you arrest people at immigration court, you're not targeting criminals, you're targeting people who are actually engaging with the legal system, who showed up for their appointments, who are trying to navigate the Byzantine immigration bureaucracy that we've created, and the message you send when you arrest people at their court hearings is that there is no path to legality, there is no reward for compliance, there is only the arbitrary exercise of state power that can snatch you up whenever it chooses, regardless of what you do. The data demolishes every justification the administration offers for these tactics, and we need to foreground this data relentlessly, because facts still matter even when they're inconvenient for authoritarian narratives. Federal data obtained by the Cato Institute shows 65% of the people booked into ICE detention since October 2024 have no criminal convictions, and more than 93% of those booked were never convicted of violent offenses. And let me repeat that because I need this to sink in. 93% of people in ICE detention were never convicted of violent offenses, despite the fact that Trump officials have repeatedly claimed they're targeting criminals. More than 75% of people booked into ICE custody in fiscal year 2025 had no criminal conviction other than an immigration or traffic-related offense, which means the vast majority of people being swept up in these raids are guilty of nothing except existing in this country without the proper paperwork. And if your response to that is, well, they broke the law by being here illegally, then you need to reckon with the fact that we're talking about a civil violation being treated like it warrants paramilitary enforcement tactics. The Immigration Research Initiative found that as immigration enforcement increases, the percent of those arrested who are convicted of a crime decreases, and the American Immigration Council said the Trump administration's scattershot approach to enforcement is simultaneously targeting longtime residents, those with no criminal records, undocumented families, migrant children, undocumented workers, and random people, and that's not my characterization, that's from a nonpartisan research organization analyzing the enforcement data. Because when you set quotas, when the increased activity from ICE reportedly stems from a directive from Stephen Miller and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem to arrest up to 3,000 immigrants each day, when you're demanding that agents hit numerical targets regardless of individualized assessments of threat or criminality, you're not doing law enforcement, you're doing ethnic cleansing disguised as bureaucracy. Congresswoman Brown said that this backwardness doesn't end there, and she's absolutely right, because the administration also abandoned the United States' role as a global leader in the fight against trafficking, cutting 1,353 positions at the State Department, including closing or eviscerating the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which for 25 years has worked to combat human sex and labor trafficking around the world. This office produced an annual report required by Congress that grades every country on trafficking issues. The report, scheduled for release on June 30, was abruptly canceled without explanation, and as of mid-September had yet to be released despite being required by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and it's never been released later than June before. You want to talk about accountability? This is an office that had bipartisan support for 2.5 decades, that was reauthorized during Trump's first term, that had actual teeth because countries that failed to meet standards could face consequences tied to U.S. foreign aid, and they just obliterated it. Further reductions of the TIP staff in July brought the total removed from the office to 71% since the Trump administration took over, and much of the funding earmarked for dispersal by the TIP has been diverted or frozen without explanation, leaving nonprofit human trafficking victim foundations that depend on grants to stay operational with no money and no timetable. Do you understand what that means in human terms? There are organizations right now that rescue trafficking victims, that provide trauma services, that help people rebuild their lives after escaping modern slavery, and they've had their funding cut off because this administration decided that harassing farm workers and car wash employees was a higher priority than stopping human trafficking networks. Let me connect this to the larger pattern, because nothing about this administration's immigration policy makes sense unless you understand that the cruelty is the point, and that the actual goal has nothing to do with public safety or border security and everything to do with creating a visible spectacle of ethnic domination. The Cato Institute found that ICE had diverted over 25,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers from their jobs, including 14,498 from federal agencies, and FBI data found that nearly a quarter of FBI agents, including nearly half in major offices, had been reassigned to support immigration enforcement. Think about what that represents in terms of opportunity cost. We're talking about thousands of law enforcement professionals with expertise in counterterrorism, in organized crime, in financial fraud, in violent crime investigation, and they've been pulled off those cases to support immigration sweeps that are predominantly nabbing nonviolent people with no criminal records. By November 2025, immigration cases had overtaken drug and fraud cases in U.S. courts, with the number of immigration cases tripling on an annual basis, while new fraud and drug cases fell by 17% and 27% respectively, which means the federal justice system is being overwhelmed with immigration prosecutions at the direct expense of other forms of law enforcement, and you cannot convince me that this makes Americans safer when FBI agents who should be investigating domestic terrorism are instead processing paperwork for people whose only crime is picking vegetables without documentation. This is not public safety policy, this is punishment for existing while brown. This is using the entire apparatus of federal law enforcement as a cudgel against immigrant communities regardless of the cost to actual security or justice. Congresswoman Brown called these ICE tactics incredibly dangerous and cowardly, and both adjectives are precisely correct because there's nothing brave about masked agents in unmarked vehicles grabbing people who are shopping for groceries or attending court or working their jobs, and it's absolutely dangerous not just to the people being targeted, but to the entire architecture of rights and liberties that supposedly protect all of us. Stepped-up community arrests are having a marked impact on immigrant-heavy neighborhoods in the Boston area, where people are not going to their doctor's appointments, kids not going to school, folks not going grocery shopping, and ICE's aggressive tactics have been defined by a general level of mean-spiritedness and brutality, including masked agents and people dragged out of immigration court. This creates what scholars of authoritarianism call a climate of terror, where the randomness and unpredictability of enforcement is itself a form of social control, where you don't need to arrest everyone if you can make everyone afraid that they might be arrested at any moment, where the psychological toll of living under constant threat of state violence achieves the goal of subordinating entire communities. The sweeping raids have instilled a persistent mental anxiety within the immigrant community when encountering local police or National Guard troops who might report them to federal immigration officers. And even if you've got your papers, even though you're a U.S. citizen, you kind of have to check over your shoulder, which means we're creating a society where citizenship provides no protection, where documentation doesn't guarantee safety, where your legal status becomes irrelevant in the face of enforcement operations that operate more like military raids than civilian policing. The militarization aspect cannot be overstated, because President Trump issued a memorandum federalizing 2,000 California National Guard troops to quell immigration protests in Los Angeles pursuant to an obscure provision in federal law not used since and the last time the National Guard was federalized over a governor's objection was in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson deployed the Guard to Selma to protect civil rights demonstrators. The historical irony is so bitter it's almost unbearable. The same constitutional mechanism used to protect civil rights protesters from state violence is now being weaponized to suppress protests against federal immigration enforcement. Extensive criticism ensued following a military-style ICE raid at a residential apartment complex in Chicago, featuring agents rappelling from Black Hawk helicopters at 1 a.m., tossing flashbangs at families, and rounding up and zip-tying adults, children, and U.S. citizens. Helicopters at 1 in the morning, flashbangs thrown at families, children zip-tied. This is not law enforcement. This is counterinsurgency tactics deployed against civilian populations. The opening of an immigration detention camp at Fort Bliss, built behind the walls of a military installation away from public view, is a calculated move to militarize immigration enforcement, reduce transparency, and fast-track deportations with minimal accountability, and the administration plans to open detention camps on at least 2 more military bases with additional troops deployed to support ICE operations nationwide, using the military to carry out a deportation agenda that is unprecedented and deeply dangerous. Fort Bliss, let me emphasize this, was used during World War II as an internment camp for people of Japanese descent, and was also used during Trump's first term to detain children separated from their families. So we're literally reopening sites of historical infamy to detain immigrants in what amounts to military prison camps. And if you're not horrified by that, then you haven't been paying attention to how democracy dies. Congresswoman Brown warned that this helps traffickers while terrifying immigrants out of reporting crimes, and this is the cruelest paradox of the administration's approach, because when you create an environment where immigrants are afraid to interact with any form of law enforcement, you don't just harm those individuals, you create zones of impunity where criminals can operate with confidence that their victims won't report them. Trump's actions chill the reporting of sex trafficking and forced labor, because his goal of mass deportations and aggressive use of immigration detention keep immigrant victims in the shadows too fearful to report their victimization, and collaborations between ICE and local law enforcement make it even less likely that trafficking victims who already fear deportation and reprisals from their traffickers will feel safe seeking help. Human traffickers understand this dynamic perfectly. They know that when immigrants fear deportation more than they fear their exploiters, the balance of power shifts entirely in favor of the traffickers. They know they can threaten their victims with calling ICE. They know that victims won't go to police, won't seek medical care, won't testify in court, and the administration knows this too. They have access to the same research and expertise that we do, which means the choice to gut anti-trafficking offices while ramping up immigration raids is not an unfortunate side effect of aggressive enforcement. It's an acceptance that increased trafficking is worth it if it achieves the larger goal of terrorizing immigrant communities. Republicans have for years made human trafficking a key issue, and for Secretary of State Marco Rubio, anti-trafficking work has been a centerpiece of his policy agenda, as recently as May, discussing concerns about a rise in human trafficking, yet Rubio is overseeing the gutting of the very office that does this work, and a former ambassador who worked in the George W. Bush administration said people really thought the broad bipartisan support for 25 years since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000 would provide some protection, and it did not, and people are both surprised and disappointed. The surprise is understandable, but the disappointment should have curdled into rage by now, because we're watching in real time as institutions that took decades to build, that represented hard-won consensus about protecting human dignity, are being demolished with no plan to replace them with anything except detention camps and masked enforcement squads. The fiscal dimensions reveal priorities with perfect clarity because Congress recently passed a reconciliation bill that allocated $170 billion toward immigration enforcement, including $45 billion specifically for detention, making ICE's detention budget 62% larger than the entire federal prison system. And the Trump administration has already spent $1.2 billion on the Fort Bliss tent camp, rather than funding public services Texans urgently need. $1.2 billion for a tent camp, and Trump's big beautiful bill passed by Congress in July 2025 gave ICE $75 billion of funding for the next 4 years, up from around $8 billion a year, which represents an almost tenfold increase in ICE funding. And what are we getting for that investment in terms of public safety? We're getting masked agents arresting car wash employees, farm workers, U.S. citizens, and people attending their immigration court hearings. Those aren't national security threats. Those are workers and family members and people engaging with legal processes. But advocates for immigrant rights say the community arrests from raids at factories and restaurants to surprise detentions at ICE check-ins are punitive measures aimed at instilling fear in blue states and cities, reflecting a deliberate federal strategy to punish Massachusetts and other immigrant-friendly states for standing up against Trump's reckless deportation machine. The federalism crisis here is profound because we're watching the federal government weaponize immigration enforcement to punish states that don't share the administration's ideological commitments, using immigration policy as a cudgel to discipline political opposition. And that's not how federalism is supposed to work in a constitutional democracy. That's how authoritarian regimes consolidate power by crushing regional resistance. Congresswoman Brown is part of a larger resistance from Democratic members of Congress who are trying to sound the alarm about these developments. Brown stated that when she sees the dangerous and cruel way that the current president treats and talks about immigrants, she knows she's not dealing with a serious and solutions-driven administration because propagating lies and misplaced fear risks making the problem worse. And on Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order authorizing ICE to raid schools, churches, and hospitals with little to no oversight or plan. Schools and churches and hospitals, and the Trump administration reversed the policy of the previous administration and gave ICE permission to raid schools, hospitals, and places of worship, locations that had been considered sensitive for very good reasons, because when you tell parents that immigration agents might show up at their children's schools, you ensure that some kids won't attend school. When you raid hospitals, you ensure that sick people won't seek medical care. When you raid churches, you destroy sanctuary and community trust. In June 2025, the Los Angeles Unified School District announced plans to implement a security perimeter around graduation sites to protect students and families from ICE, which is a sentence that should make every American hang their heads in shame, because we've created conditions where school districts have to protect graduation ceremonies from federal immigration agents, where families are afraid to watch their children graduate because they might be arrested. And that's not a country devoted to opportunity and education. That's a country where state power is deployed to prevent people from celebrating their children's achievements. The through line connecting all of these developments is a systematic assault on the idea that rights inhere in persons rather than in citizenship, that constitutional protections apply to everyone on American soil regardless of immigration status, that law enforcement must operate within constitutional constraints even when targeting undocumented immigrants. When immigration enforcement adopts the tools and tactics of warfare, it brings that logic inward. It turns neighbors into suspects. It prioritizes containment over compassion. And to defend civil liberties is not only to protect the rights of immigrants, but to protect the integrity of the Constitution itself for everyone. Because once you establish that federal agents can operate without identification, without warrants, with military support, targeting people based on ethnicity and immigration status, you've created precedents that can be turned against any disfavored group. You've normalized tactics that authoritarian movements have used throughout history to consolidate power through selective enforcement and state terror. This is why Congresswoman Brown's testimony matters so profoundly, why we need to amplify her voice and the voices of every elected official willing to speak truth about what's happening, because the normalization of horror requires silence and acquiescence. It requires people to look away, or rationalize or tell themselves that surely it can't be as bad as it sounds. But it is as bad as it sounds. It's actually worse because the scale is difficult to comprehend. Because from February through May, ICE detained an average of about 20,000 immigrants each month, a more than threefold increase from 2024, because average daily arrests were up 68% to about 1,000 a day in June 2025, compared with the same month a year earlier, because the Trump administration is on pace to deport nearly 600,000 people by the end of Trump's first year of his second term, and ICE was already on pace to surpass 300,000 deportations by September 30, the highest number recorded in a single fiscal year since the Obama administration. These numbers represent human beings. They represent families torn apart. They represent children watching their parents arrested. They represent workers who contributed to their communities for decades being grabbed off the street. They represent asylum seekers who fled violence being sent back to the countries they escaped. And the aggregate effect of this kind of systematic violence against immigrant communities is not just individual tragedy, although it absolutely is that. It's the transformation of the American social contract. It's the message that some people matter and others don't, that some communities deserve protection while others deserve persecution, that citizenship conveys not just legal status, but fundamental human worth. Congresswoman Brown called the ICE agents cowardly, and she's right, because courage would look like confronting the actual drivers of migration, including American foreign policy that destabilizes countries throughout the hemisphere, including climate change that's making large swaths of the world uninhabitable, including economic inequality that creates desperation, including violence and persecution that force people to flee. Courage would look like creating functional immigration pathways that recognize we need immigrant labor and that people will keep coming regardless of enforcement levels. Courage would look like protecting the vulnerable, including trafficking victims, instead of gutting the offices that help them. But this administration has no interest in courage or solutions or even basic decency. They're interested in spectacle and domination, and the political utility of an enemy that can be scapegoated endlessly. The resistance to this cannot be passive or symbolic. It requires the kind of organized collective action that communities are beginning to build, where networks spanning multiple counties include more than 100 immigrant, labor, legal, faith and community organizations dedicated to advancing constitutional rights, with infrastructure that responds rapidly to immigration enforcement operations, verifying information and deploying individuals trained in constitutional observer programs who exercise legal rights when documenting federal agents in public. This is what democracy looks like when the state turns against portions of its population. It looks like neighbors protecting neighbors. It looks like documenting abuses. It looks like creating early warning systems and legal support networks. It looks like clergy and teachers and ordinary citizens saying this is not acceptable and we will not be complicit through our silence. Congresswoman Brown is doing her part by using her platform in Congress to expose these policies, by putting the contradictions and cruelties on the record, by refusing to let the administration pretend that this is normal law enforcement, and we need to support her and every elected official who's willing to stand up, because the political costs of resistance are real, when a significant portion of the electorate has been convinced that immigration is an existential threat, and that whatever measures are necessary to address it are justified. But the moral and historical costs of acquiescence are far higher, because we know how this story ends when democracies fail to protect vulnerable populations, when they militarize enforcement, when they create apparatus of state terror dressed up as law and order. We know because we've seen it before, and the people who looked away or told themselves it wasn't their problem, or convinced themselves the victims must have done something to deserve it, those people don't get remembered kindly by history. They get remembered as collaborators in atrocity through their silence. So when you hear Congresswoman Shontel Brown torch Trump ICE squads as cowardly thugs, when you hear her detail how anti-trafficking experts are being redeployed to harass nonviolent immigrants, when you hear her explain how gutting anti-trafficking offices helps traffickers while terrifying victims, you need to understand that she's not being hyperbolic. She's not exaggerating for effect. She's documenting a systematic assault on human rights and rule of law that will define this era of American history. And the question is whether we'll be among those who stood up or among those who looked away. Because I promise you, history is watching, and it will not be kind to those who chose comfort over courage when the stakes were this high and the moral clarity was this absolute.